Okay, welcome everybody. We are getting started. Thank you for joining us tonight for this webinar as part of our National Solar Congress. While folks are trickling in, I'd like to encourage you to take a second to fill out the introduction poll we have here, just trying to see how many folks on the line are solar owners and also what type of electric utility serves you. And if you could also, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. And make sure you send your chat to all panelists and attendees, both at the beginning and throughout the evening, so that everybody can see your message. I want to make sure that all folks know who's on the line and everybody sees what great questions you asked tonight. So we're going to let folks come in here for a couple minutes. So please go ahead and fill out the poll questions and share your name and where you're joining from in the chat. And we'll get started here in just a minute. And I see a few more folks joining. So once again, thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Zach Schalk. I am the Indiana Program Director for Solar United Neighbors. Really excited for this session about Indiana's solar policy tonight. While you're joining, please go ahead and respond to our introduction poll questions and introduce yourself and say where you're calling in from in the chat. Make sure you send your chat to all panelists and attendees. And we'll be getting started here in just a minute. We're waiting for a few more folks to join as we get a few minutes after the top of the hour. All right, well, I see that we are 2 after, and so I think we can go ahead and get started. Once again, thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Zach Schalk. I'm the Indiana Program Director for Solar United Neighbors. Really excited for everybody to join us tonight. This session, which we've called a Solar Agenda for Indiana, is part of our National Solar Congress. Normally, we do these solar congresses in person in each state, but this year, obviously, due to COVID-19, we're doing these online. So I really appreciate those of you who are joining us tonight for this Indiana-specific session. But I did just want to make sure everybody knows that we do have a full calendar of meetings that are going on all throughout the week after several continuous weeks of webinars. So hopefully, in addition to joining us tonight, you'll check out some of those recordings if you haven't been able to join us in the past, and take a look at the full schedule to see other events that are coming up. Including tomorrow night, we do have a panel discussion focusing on HOA solar access issues, which will be primarily focusing on Virginia and directed by our Virginia Program Director, Aaron Such, but we'll also feature a presentation from Indiana's own Joey Miles. So make sure you join that so you don't miss out. And with that, we can go ahead and get started. So first, I did just want to start with a little bit of housekeeping. I assume that most folks are familiar with Zoom at this point, but for those who are still new to it, hopefully you've selected the audio that is best for you. So you can either choose a mic on your computer and speakers, or call in with your telephone. I also want to encourage folks throughout the night to submit any questions you have via the chat function. Again, make sure that you submit questions to all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see them. But we will have time for Q&A at the end of this webinar, so make sure to share your questions in the chat both during the presentation and at the end of the event, and we'll make sure to get to you. And then finally, this webinar is being recorded. And we will share a recording with everybody who RSVP'd after the event. So first, I did just want to make sure to introduce Solar United Neighbors for those of you who might not be familiar with us. So we are a national 501c3 nonprofit organization. We started in 2007, and we are dedicated to helping Hoosiers go solar, join together, and fight for their energy rights. And we will talk a little bit later in the presentation about some opportunities that we have available right now to help folks go solar if that's something you're interested in. But for the rest of tonight, we'll really be zeroing in on solar policies and what you as a solar advocate, a solar owner, a solar supporter can do to help Indiana embrace a solar future. So we'll have a few different sections for this presentation tonight. I'm going to start us off with a discussion about Indiana's solar market and the kind of laying the lay of the land here in Indiana. Then Ben Inskeep from EQ Research will discuss a solar agenda for Indiana and some great policies that we think Indiana should be looking into, as well as examples from other states around the country and around the Midwest that we can point to for inspiration. And then finally, Jackie Walburn from Solarize Indiana will help to moderate our question and answer session at the end of the event. So let's talk about Indiana's solar landscape. We have seen a fantastic growth among Indiana's solar owners over the last several years, thanks in no small part to the work of Solarize Indiana and other groups that have been advocating for and helping to assist homeowners go solar. And basically what we see here on the slide is a map that captures some known solar installations around the state from Siren. And as you can see, there's been significant growth in solar. And on the right, we have some stats that are compiled from the Solar Energy Industries Association and from the net metering reports that are filed with the IURC. And basically what we see is that as of 2019, there were more than 3,600 solar jobs in Indiana. And when you look at the net metering report, we see that there are nearly 4,000 residential or commercial, industrial, and school customers benefiting from net metering just in Indiana's 5 investor-owned utilities territories alone. So we see that thousands of Hoosiers around the state are seeing the benefit of solar, investing in rooftop solar, and seeing returns both in lower electric bills and a cleaner, healthier environment for Hoosiers all over the state. But as the shift to solar has kind of accelerated in recent years, we're starting to see a separation between customer-owned distributed generation solar and utility solar. So even though several Indiana utilities are starting to embrace solar as part of their long-term resource plans, and especially as the cost of solar technology has decreased significantly over the last few years, solar energy has become oftentimes the cheapest source of electricity generation available on the market. And so we've seen several utilities, especially NIPSCO, Vectren, and Hoosier Energy make big headlines with commitments to large solar investments. NIPSCO just earlier today announced significant planned solar investments around the state, which is great. We absolutely are excited to see utilities embracing solar as a significant part of their future energy resource mix. But unfortunately, utilities are still putting roadblocks in place that will potentially leave customers out of the equation. And so we're here tonight to make sure that customers don't get left behind. And if we are going to reach an energy system or create an energy system that's clean, just, and equitable, and that distributes benefits and control to local communities, we need to make sure that rooftop solar is a part of the equation, and we need to make sure that customers are able to have a seat at the table. And so one of the key policies that has been in place that has allowed and empowered solar customers in the residential and some other small scale markets to really be successful is what's called net metering. I'm sure most of you on the line are probably familiar with net metering. If you're interested in taking a deeper dive into net metering. We actually did a whole panel just focused on net metering in different states and different localities around the country earlier this week. So I would encourage you to check out the recording of that webinar. But basically, net metering creates a solar offset that allows the solar owner to benefit from the excess electricity they might be generating during different parts of the day by accumulating credits, kilowatt hour credits on their bill that they can benefit from when their panels aren't producing electricity. So what you see here is basically how that works out for an average customer. This is for a residential customer who might have, at least when we were all going to work, might have a peak in the beginning of the day when they get up, and then another peak in their energy usage in the evening. But their solar panels would obviously be producing the most electricity during the day when they might not be using it at home. And so net metering allows them to build up credits, especially if your system is designed to cover 100% of your annual electricity usage. You build up excess credits in the months that have longer days, like in the summer, that then you can spend down in the months that don't have as much sunshine, like in the winter. And so this really allows for solar customers to benefit from the electricity that they are generating and the other benefits that they're adding to the grid without having to invest in a battery or other systems to take them actually off the grid. However, in 2017, a law called SEA 309 was passed that actually established a timeline for phasing out net metering. And so this was a very unpopular bill at the time, especially among solar supporters. The Indiana solar movement really turned out and fought tooth and nail. But unfortunately, the electric utilities that were pushing for this policy had more power in the state house and were ultimately successful in passing the law. And so what the law says is that net metering will be offered until July 1, 2022, or at least until the utility reaches 1.5% of their peak load from net metered customers, whichever is sooner. And so the reason that's important is that, as I'll talk about shortly, some utilities are actually already reaching or expecting to exceed that 1.5% cap, which will actually potentially end net metering earlier in their territory. So systems installed before net metering ends will receive full retail credits until 2032. And I should also mention, for folks who installed their solar systems before December 31st of 2017, they're grandfathered in to receive full retail rate net metering until 2047. But systems installed after the deadline, whether that's the 2022 deadline or potentially earlier in some of those utility territories, they will not receive net metering. Once net metering goes away, the typical customer will receive credits that are based on the marginal price, which is typically about a third of the retail rate, plus 25%. And so that rate is actually in the process of being set in one utility territory, and will potentially, that process must start in all the other investor-owned utility territories no later than March 1 of next year. And this law does only apply for investor-owned utilities. So rural co-ops and municipal utilities are not covered. They might continue offering net metering longer, or some of them already right now do not offer net metering. And so I mentioned earlier that there is already a utility that is seeking to end net metering. So that's Vectren, which serves part of Southwest Indiana around Evansville. And so they are actually seeking to end net metering for new solar customers as early as January 1 of 2021. So significantly earlier than that July 1, 2022 deadline I mentioned earlier. And so there is a case pending before the IURC, the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, that will determine what happens in Vectren territory. Several other groups, including Solar United Neighbors and several other groups, have intervened in the case. So we are actively seeking to protect net metering and at least protect and make sure we get the fairest possible credit for excess generation produced by distributed solar customers. But the outcome of that case will absolutely set a precedent for other utilities. So folks around the state are watching closely. And so this kind of, to wrap things up, leads us to why we need to take action now. So as I mentioned, Vectren is seeking a ruling in their case by the end of this year, which will set a statewide precedent depending on what the IURC does in that case. And Indiana's other investor-owned utilities, Duke, IPL, NIPSCO, and INM, must start the same process by March 1 of next year. That's a requirement of SCA 309. So at least by March 1 of next year, the other utilities under the current law will start a similar process to determine what the successor to net metering under SCA 309 will be in their territory. Another factor to consider, something I haven't mentioned yet, is an entity called the 21st Century Energy Policy Development Task Force, which is meeting right now, is made up of both legislators and other experts determined by the governor. And they're actually reviewing Indiana's current energy policies and will issue a report by December 1 of this year with policy recommendations to be considered by the General Assembly. The chair of one of the co-chairs of the task force has made it clear that this task force is not meant to cover distributed energy resources, but it's still important to note that these conversations are happening at a high level, and that we do expect to see some activity in energy policy in the upcoming General Assembly session. And finally, as I mentioned the General Assembly, we do anticipate that the General Assembly session will start in January, though there are some questions about that given uncertainties around COVID. But basically, the key point to take away is that the time is now to start contacting legislators, making sure that these issues are priorities to be considered in the 2021 General Assembly session and beyond. And so with that, I will go ahead and kick it over to Ben to talk about some policy priorities.
Thanks, Zach. Great job on laying out the framework right now in place in Indiana. One of the things I would like to discuss here is just to touch on what's happening across the rest of the country and specifically in our region in the Midwest here in our neighboring states. Before getting into some recommendations on how Indiana can move forward with its solar policy and make improvements. So before I dive in, I am Ben Inskeep. I am a policy analyst at EQ Research, which is a clean energy policy consulting firm based out of North Carolina. I live in Indianapolis, so I'm a Hoosier, and really happy to be talking about Indiana solar policy and to see all the progress we've made to date. But clearly we do have a lot of work to do going forward when it comes to rooftop solar and distributed solar. So on this slide here, I wanted to kind of highlight just how popular net metering is across the country. It's one of the most popular policies that states have enacted to support rooftop solar and other distributed solar. So that's 39 states that currently offer what Zach is describing here as net metering, with that one-to-one crediting for extra energy that you generate with your rooftop solar that then goes to your neighbor's house and they can use it when you're not needing it. A few states have already moved beyond net metering to a different policy framework called net billing. And that policy framework has reduced credits for extra energy that are exported to the grid. So Michigan is an example of that state where they have implemented that. And then some states never implemented net metering to begin with. But as you can see from this map, just about everyone in the Midwest either has net metering or used to have net metering. Next slide, please, Zach. One policy I did want to briefly mention, just to highlight how we should conceptualize or think about that value of a solar when it comes to rooftop solar or other distributed solar, is to touch on this concept called the value of solar that was pioneered in places like Minnesota. And so this slide, I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of the details here. It's just meant to kind of illustrate all the different values that solar produces that we need to stack up together in order to think about what is the fair overall value for extra solar energy generated by a rooftop solar system that then gets sent to the grid to benefit your neighbors. And so this slide, you can see there's a whole bunch of different values. It's not just the energy that's generated. It's things like you're using the grid less, so you're causing less wear and tear on the grid. You're not having the utility have to generate that electricity for you, or find that capacity out there for you. And so those values also need to be incorporated into that compensation rate when you're exporting extra energy. And then also important to note is that in that very top category, the avoided environmental cost is explicitly part of Minnesota's value of solar. So you can think about that in a couple ways when you apply it here to Indiana. That's things like avoiding the costs of complying with things like coal environmental requirements that that are an extra expense on coal plants. It could also be things like considering climate change and how emissions from fossil fuels cause damages and harm. And when you're producing solar instead, that's creating a positive offset that should be valued. Next slide. So in the Midwest, we have seen quite a bit of policy action in the last few years when it comes to rooftop solar, net metering, and similar policies. So as Zach mentioned, in Indiana, we passed a law in 2017 that's going to be phasing out net metering and has some unfortunate provisions that are pretty rigid in how they're applied and don't allow our regulators the flexibility to incorporate something like the Minnesota value of solar policy or find another framework that would better replace net metering down the road once we have more solar here. So let me just touch on a few of these policies. I won't go through all of them here, but I did want to touch on some of the high points and some of the low points. So as I mentioned, Minnesota has been a pioneer when it comes to thinking about how we should value solar and how we can come up with that value. And they've done that in the context of creating the largest community solar program in the nation. Now, community solar allows folks who can't install solar on their roofs for whatever reason that might be. Maybe you're a renter, maybe you have an old roof, maybe you have shading on your roof. But it allows these customers to all go in on one larger system, one larger solar system that's located in the community and still get credited for the energy that's produced by that system, just as if it was on top of their roof, that portion of that system that they subscribe to. So Illinois is another state that has seen a lot of solar development in their state because they also passed a community solar legislation. When it comes to net metering specifically, I think a great state for Indiana to look to is the example set by Iowa. They passed legislation this year that's a bit of a compromise between the utilities in that state and solar and other environmental advocates in that state. And as a result, it enjoyed really broad support across the legislature there when it passed this year. One of the nice things about this bill is it recognizes that solar is still a growing technology in that state. And so it says, we're going to keep net metering in place for at least the next 7 years. There's a guardrail there if the utility all of a sudden sees a massive growth in solar and there's issues there. So the utility has an off ramp to propose a policy sooner. But if solar continues to grow at its current rate, it's going to stay in place in terms of the current net metering policy through 2027. And then it creates this nice framework where it makes it clear of how that next policy is going to be developed using a value of solar regime, just like in Minnesota. So I think that's a pretty promising framework to consider. In contrast, we have some states neighboring us that have taken steps backwards when it comes to their net metering policies. Michigan is one example where in 2016 they passed a law that's allowing utilities there to phase out net metering and replace it with a much lower credit rate. Not as low as Vectron's proposing in southern Indiana, but still quite a bit of a reduction compared to what customers used to be getting for their extra solar energy. Likewise, Kentucky passed a law last year that is allowing utilities there to propose alternatives. And so we could see the commission there adopt a policy that would also slash the credit rate that solar gets for, that rooftop solar gets for extra energy put onto the grid. Next slide, please. And then I'll just touch on a few other examples from around the country that I think illustrate, just how, while you might have seen headlines about folks pushing back on net metering in some places, by and large, it's still the dominant policy in place, and it still enjoys a lot of support from regulators and lawmakers. So one example was in Arkansas, where that state passed legislation that would have allowed the utility regulators there to slash net metering or create new charges on solar customers. The regulators took a good hard look and looked at all the evidence and said, you know what? There's not any reason that we should be ending net metering yet. We should be keeping the policy in place. It's still, solar is still a really small part of our state's electricity generation. And so let's keep it in place at least for the next couple of years. And then in 2022 or after 2022, if the utilities want to come back and make a really strong case of why we need to change it, we'll then consider changes at that time. In Kansas, the state Supreme Court there struck down discriminatory charges on solar customers that the utility Evergy had put in place a few years back. The Supreme Court there found that you can't just go ahead and make discriminatory charges on solar customers. You can't single them out for no good reason. And then in South Carolina, recently a settlement agreement was filed between Duke Energy and some parties there that struck an interesting balance that's going to preserve many of the essence or much of the essence of net metering there, but also make some small tweaks that are going to help, for one, help align customers' energy usage with the grid needs. So I'm talking about things like putting solar customers there on a time of use rate, where the rate you pay for electricity varies by the time of day. So that it costs a little bit more when the grid is really taxed and everybody's running their AC at full blast at 5 o'clock on a really hot summer day. But it also does things like create an incentive for solar customers that do things like install a smart meter and let the utility take advantage of that smart meter on those really, really hot summer days a few times of the year when the utility is struggling to keep up with all that demand. They can tap into that meter to benefit the grid. And so this is an example of utility coming together to create this kind of settlement agreement that results in the preservation of a regime that's going to allow solar to continue to grow, even though there's things in there that might not be, solar advocates might not, be strongly advocating for, like a $30 minimum bill, for example, here. But this just goes to show you that, Duke Energy is also operating in Indiana. There's no reason why we can't have a reasonable policy framework in place here, just like they were able to find that right balance in South Carolina. Next slide, please. So how can we make solar thrive here in Indiana in our context? So 3 points. First, we need to stop the implementation of SEA 309 or SB 309. SEA is just Senate Enrolled Act. SB is just Senate bill. So regardless of what you call it, we need to stop that bill in its tracks. As Zach pointed out, this Vectren proposal that's before regulators right now would really decimate the solar industry if it is adopted. So we don't want the Vectren proposal to be adopted, and we also don't want the other utilities to come in next year, as they're currently required to, and file changes that are going to really undermine solar growth there. We should also study the path forward in the state so we can create a stable policy that can benefit everybody. So that's kind of like the example I gave in Iowa, where they created this value of solar process for the utility regulators to find a better path forward after we've had a lot of solar growth and once it's the right time to evolve our policy. And then finally, in the meantime, Indiana could benefit by expanding its net metering policy to encompass more folks so that more Hoosiers can take advantage of the benefits of solar in the meantime. So Zach, let's move to the next slide and let's get into some of the details on what exactly I mean by expanding the net metering benefits. So what I'm talking about here is not creating any new subsidies. It's not raising taxes. It's none of that. It's all about improving just the regulatory structure, cutting red tape, and preventing utilities from being able to keep folks from going solar. So first is we should extend the end date of net metering. Right now it's set to expire by July 2022. So first of all, our first priority needs to be, we want to extend that date and push it back so we can have more time to grow solar in the state and develop a smarter alternative than what was created in that bill that's ending it. So Iowa, again, is a good example for how to set a clear process and an ample timeline to examine these issues. Next up, we should increase our cap. As Zach pointed out, we have a wimpy 1.5% cap. That means 98.5% plus of the electricity will be in the utilities' hands. Other states have a much larger net metering cap, meaning more folks can go solar. For example, Illinois and Iowa have a 5% cap, so several times bigger than here in Indiana. We're getting left in the dust if we stick with 1.5%. Let's also let bigger solar play too. Right now, the law specifies an eligible system size. If we can bump that up, it'll open up the door to larger businesses and larger customers also getting to take advantage of the benefits of having solar installed on site. So we want to make sure there's no constraints when it comes to things like schools wanting to benefit from solar and being able to offset their energy usage. So one example of a state that's done this is Ohio's net metering policy. Doesn't set a specific size. It just says as long as your system is designed to offset your annual energy usage, you're okay. Next slide, please. Finally, the last couple ways we can unleash the benefits of net metering here. First of all, let's create a community solar garden program so that everybody in the state can access solar, whether or not it's on their own roof or whether it's through community solar. So Illinois and Minnesota are both great examples from the Midwest, but also nationally, just in terms of how much they've been able to grow their solar by unleashing community solar garden programs. Finally, let's let customers aggregate multiple meters. Right now, you can't do this, but imagine if you're Target or Kroger or another company, and you can install solar at one site, but not at another site in the same utilities area. So this would allow you to install solar in one store and use the credits from that solar facility generates to offset your other charges on your other meter. So it's a way for customers such as municipalities, school districts, commercial customers that will have multiple utility meters in an area. It's a way for them to be able to unlock the benefits of net metering, given they might not be able to install solar at every site, and they might want to install a larger amount of solar at one place to help offset their needs at another place. Okay, and so finally, let's turn it back over here to Zach. Zach, how can folks get involved in the net metering conversation in solar here in Indiana? What are the steps that they can take?
Funny you should ask, Ben. Thank you for that great dive into some solar policies that we absolutely think Indiana should be embracing. And I do just want to real quick before I dive into what you can do, encourage folks if you have any questions. We saw some great questions come in, some just to panelists, some to everybody. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Please send the questions to all panelists and attendees so everybody can see your questions. We might spark some other questions that come from other folks on the line. So yeah, it's a great question. What can you do? So we're going to talk about a few things that we think we can help, Solar United Neighbors can help solar supporters, solar owners do, but then we're also going to talk about some other ways that if you aren't a solar owner, you can help to build our constituency and some things that you can do to take action here tonight. So I'm going to talk about a few of these approaches, and I'm going to ask Lisa to please go ahead and launch our next poll as well. Because while I'm going to describe a few of these different options, we're also hoping that folks on the line tonight will be willing to make a commitment. So select any of these that you think you might be interested in doing, and that just gives us an opportunity to follow up with you when there are opportunities to take some of these actions in the future. But so what you see here on this slide is a little bit of a pyramid kind of pointing towards the peak for influencing policymakers. And this is a very brief version of our grassroots solar lobbying presentation that we've given in the past, and I'm sure we'll give in the future. But we just wanted to give a little taste for folks tonight about different things that you can do, whether you're a solar owner or just a solar supporter, to take action. So really, the baseline is kind of mass online action, sometimes dismissively called clicktivism or slacktivism, but we really think that is a powerful opportunity both for you as an individual to kind of feel empowered and learn a little bit about the process of making solar policy, but then also make it easy for you to contact your legislator through an online form that really lowers the bar and kind of gets you comfortable contacting your legislators. And we will share a little later this evening a form that we do have online right now that you can use to contact your legislator right now. Kind of moving up a little bit, the more personal your contact gets, the greater potential impact you can have. So sending a personal email or letter, making a personal phone call, and using your own words to advocate for distributed solar and why you think Indiana should embrace the policies that Ben just outlined. Next, we have attending an event. Obviously a little bit trickier today with COVID, but like attending an online event like this right now is a great way to learn about these issues, get more comfortable talking about them, and then ultimately help you do kind of the next couple items here, which is testifying when there is opportunity for public input. Unfortunately, especially given some of the uncertainties around COVID in the upcoming General Assembly session, it'll probably be more challenging than ever, and it's never easy. The General Assembly does not like to make it easy for the public to have their say, but we will absolutely keep you informed about opportunities to contact to testify on pro-solar or against anti-solar policies. And then finally, meeting in person or virtually with your legislator, your state legislator in either house, and also with staff to make sure they're educated on this issue. They know that you care enough about this to contact them and to set up a meeting in person. And these are things that we are absolutely going to, over the next several months and into the General Assembly session next year, we'll continue to communicate with our solar supporters and members of Indiana's solar movement around the state, and make sure you have several opportunities to take the action that's appropriate for you. So we'll go ahead and leave the poll open just a little bit longer, or we can close the poll. But so thank you for making a commitment to fight for your solar rights this year. I did also want to mention another way that you can help to build Indiana's solar movement, and that's by going solar. So if you aren't already a solar owner, one of the key things that we do in the state is help to build Indiana's solar constituency by helping more folks go solar. And so we have 4 co-ops that are open right now in Indianapolis, Boone County, Hamilton County, and Northwest Indiana. And it's quick, it's easy, it's free. You can go to the link that Lisa just put in the chat and can find one of these co-ops if that's something that you might be interested in. And there are also opportunities to go solar with Solarize Indiana, and I will let Jackie talk about that now.
Hi, thank you, Zach. Yes, so I'm Jackie Walburn, and I am the current statewide coordinator for a nonprofit that works sometimes in tandem with Sun and with Zach here with Solar United Neighbors called Solarize Indiana. So Solarize Indiana is a grassroots initiative that works within communities to partner with local solar contractors just to make it a really easy turnkey operation to make residential and business solar much easier and cheaper to obtain within your community. So we have these volunteer teams you can see on the screen that are already established, but if you're interested, wherever you're at, if you don't see your city up here in establishing a Solarize campaign within your city, then we can get in contact and we can try to see what we can do to make that happen. I think Solarize really exemplifies the think globally, act locally side of environmentalism. And when you think about solar, definitely getting involved in something like Solar United Neighbors or a campaign like Solarize kind of implements within their cities, it allows you to really take meaningful work in expanding solar, which is what I know that we all kind of want to do. But getting involved in something like this, that is the grassroots level exemplified of how you can really, really get involved to make a difference. So Solarize is a really awesome opportunity to do that. And I think moving forward from here, we're going to move on to the question and answer section. So I know that there's a lot of questions that are in the chat right now. We're going to try to see how many that we can answer today. But to start us off, we had a question early on from someone named Jackie Logan. Thank you, Jackie, for your question. That asked, how do you actually come up with the value of avoided environmental cost? So I think that this was referencing what Ben was speaking to earlier in the presentation about the total value of solar. So this question of like offset avoided environmental costs, she's just curious a little more about. If you could tell us any insight on that, Ben.
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple ways you can think about that. So one way is that just right now, Hoosiers are paying in their energy bills. We're already paying for things like the pollution control technologies that utilities have installed at their coal plants so that they can come into compliance with environmental laws. And so, so avoiding having to, avoiding those environmental technology compliance costs is one way you can concretely identify the value of solar compared to relying on coal, for example. So, that's one component, I guess, that would go into that environmental cost. A second could be things like the social cost of carbon would be a way to quantify the value of avoiding emissions that create the climate crisis. And so, there's been many studies that have attempted to quantify that and have put a value on that. And so there's, reasonable ranges out there of what that value could be. And so that would be another component that, I would think would make sense to go into that value right there as well. And so that would, take into consideration the economic harms of destabilizing our climate and the reduced economic output that results from those emissions.
Awesome, thank you, Ben. So we had another question from our friend Laura Arnold from ISEF, who specifically addressed Ben and was curious about Michigan. So she noted that even though Michigan is undergoing these processes to potentially reduce net metering credits, doesn't Michigan have better PURPA rates than Indiana?
Yeah, so there's, the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act of 1978, PURPA, specifies that utilities have to interconnect solar systems to the grid. They can't just tell them no, and that they have to pay them, a reasonable rate, which is set at the utility's avoided cost rate. And so that policy typically applies to large-scale utility-sized solar systems up to 80 megawatts. I wouldn't think of it as a replacement for net metering by any means. And so in this context, net metering is really critical for fairly valuing and fairly compensating extra generation that's put onto the grid. So even though Michigan does have a better policy when it comes to compensating larger scale solar facilities that want to connect with the grid, that is better than Indiana's and does provide more certainty for developers there. And so in many ways would be a good thing for Indiana regulators to look at emulating. When it comes to specifically for rooftop solar and distributed solar, we still need to have a different policy regime to fairly compensate customers, particularly right now when solar is such a small percentage of overall generation in Indiana.
Awesome, thank you. And we had another question from Laura that I'm also going to be throwing to you, Ben. But Laura was also wondering, she noted that Indiana has installed over 100 megawatts from the voluntary feed-in tariffs offered by IPL and NIPSCO both, and wondered if any other states have implemented voluntary feed-in tariffs.
So feed-in tariffs have not been very popular in the United States context. It's definitely was enjoyed a large popularity about a decade ago in a number of European countries, Germany in particular, but also countries like Spain and Italy, I think, also had very generous feed-in tariff programs. A downside of a feed-in tariff program compared to a net metering program is that typically under a feed-in tariff program, you are sending all of the energy generated by your solar system to the grid. So you're not actually you're not using any of that energy you generate on site for your own needs. So that's one of the nice things about net metering is you are self-consuming that electricity that you generated from the system you own, and you're only exporting for other customers to use anything extra above what your needs are. So in the United States, it's, net metering has been the dominant way to compensate rooftop solar, whereas other countries, have gone to things like a feed-in tariff. I'm not too familiar with many feed-in tariff programs across the country. California has adopted one for small scale renewables up to a few megawatts in size, for example. And there are a few other examples, but by and large, when it comes to things like residential rooftop solar, I think net metering makes a heck of a lot of sense to continue in Indiana, as opposed to thinking about a larger scale shift to something like a voluntary feed-in tariff program.
Awesome, thank you, Ben. So we had a question from Kyler, and it has a few different layers, so I'm gonna break them all down, but I imagine this will also be directed to Ben. We have a lot of policy people on the line today, which is nice. So Kyler was curious. He said, aside from profit, what are utility company motivations for opposing net metering? And are companies paying for temporary storage of energy to resolve the mismatch of generation versus consumption over time? And are utilities a profit-losing business if it weren't for state subsidies? So it's a lot of kind of money having to do with this. Would you like me to repeat that, Ben?
Okay, well, I'll start answering, and I might have to then come back to you to help fill in any gaps that I didn't cover. So yes, by and large, utilities are opposed to policies like net metering because it's in their perceived financial self-interest to oppose the policy, because it's, instead of them going out and investing money in new generating assets, which then they can turn around and collect a profit on from ratepayers, it's customers going out and making the investment and the customers benefiting. So it's not the utility shareholders benefiting. It also has the immediate impact of just reducing the sales a utility makes in a year. The more customers that are net metering means those customers are not buying electrons from the utility, means the utility's revenues are going down. And so, utilities, obviously would prefer to have a higher profit as opposed to a lower profit. So they have, utilities have engaged in a coordinated campaign now for the better part of this decade to try and undermine net metering laws around the country and create marketing campaigns to try and convince folks that there's some sort of subsidy or there's some sort of problem with net metering, when in fact, study after study has shown net metering is actually makes a lot of sense, and the benefits of it exceed the costs to customers both participating in net metering and customers not participating in net metering. So we've seen that shown in a lot of independent studies for many utilities and states across the country. Once you get to really high penetrations of solar on the grid, think Hawaii, where some of the islands there literally have 1 out of 3 households that have installed solar. So orders of magnitude more solar on rooftops than in Indiana. There they do have some technical issues with just the sheer volume of solar. And so to me, a state like that moving away from net metering made sense at that time because of that large amount of solar. That's not the case in Indiana. That's not the case in many states in America. What parts did I not answer that question, Jackie?
Oh gosh, I think that covered a lot of it. It just had to do with a lot of the financial side. Kyler, if that answers your question, if you could just send us a message in the chat to say that that's kind of what you were looking for, or if there's more that you'd like to know, then we can try to answer that for you. Moving forward, we had a question from Herbert Gaunt in the chat box, wondering, he was curious if there was a current list of state legislators showing where they stand regarding SB 309 and who voted for and against that. And I'd like to point out that Leslie Webb sent to all panelists, and something that we're going to send out to everyone today, a list of solar voting records. So we can point that to you, but I also wanted to throw that question over to Zach and ask if he can elaborate a little more on maybe resources for where you could look to find where your legislators stand. So that way, if you want to or are interested in reaching out to your legislators, that you can turn to these places. So that way, kind of everything that they've done in the past regarding solar policy.
Sure, thank you, Jackie. And I see that Leslie has reshared to everybody, so you can see the resource that she is sharing. Solar United Neighbors is a 501c3 nonprofit, so we do not endorse candidates or involve in activities, especially this close to an election. But there are certainly resources online, like what Leslie is sharing. Our friends at the Citizens Action Coalition have several fantastic resources. I think their website is sitact.org, and you can find information about past campaigns, including SCA 309, and they do reports on each General Assembly session, recording kind of from a consumer advocates and environmental perspective, bills that passed, that didn't pass, voting records, that kind of thing. And they also compile statistics on donations that are received by Indiana legislators, excuse me, and help to track what industries those donations come from. So you can find all those resources at citact.org. That's, again, Citizens Action Coalition's, excuse me, Citizens Action Coalition's website, which I think is a great resource for folks interested in kind of taking a look at what different legislators in Indiana, what their track record is on issues of distributed generation, solar, and other issues that might be important to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. So we have a few different questions here in the chat box. There's a lot revolving still around Senate Bill 309 and what will happen if that's repealed or what will happen if that's not repealed. Zach, are you willing at all to elaborate a little more on the side of things? I don't know how things are going within the advocacy world to look at if it's a possibility right now that Senate Bill 309 might be overturned, or if we would need a lot more people maybe joining us in that fight to try to see that through.
Sure, that's a great question. It's definitely going to be tough to overturn SCA 309 or really move anything proactive in this upcoming General Assembly session. It's just a reality of the politics here in Indiana right now, though. We'll have to wait and see what happens in the election to really get a sense of where our policy chances stand. And we'll also just have to wait and see what the General Assembly session is going to look like, given that this is going to be an unprecedented session, both just in terms of how the session is structured because of COVID-19, but also in terms of all of the issues that are going to be demanding attention because of the pandemic health crisis that our community has been in for the better part of this year. So it's absolutely going to be a challenge. And while we are absolutely committed to fighting tooth and nail to try to make progress this year, we also recognize that this is going to be a multi-year fight if we are going to be successful. If you think back to the states that Ben referenced with policies that we would like to emulate, like in South Carolina or Minnesota or Illinois, those were all the result of multi-year campaigns that brought together diverse coalitions from different backgrounds with different interests behind an agenda that ultimately was shared across those groups. And so that's how they built the power. It wasn't just solar advocates arguing for in support of net metering. It was labor interests arguing for good paying jobs. It was folks who are fighting for equity and inclusion in the energy system, making sure that energy democracy is a part of the energy future. So there's a lot of work that we have to do as a solar movement to reach out into different communities in Indiana and make sure that we're building power together and working towards a more inclusive goal that yes, we think should include rooftop solar as a key part of that for all the benefits, all the reasons that we talked about tonight, but is likely one part of a broader vision that is really going to move both the people and hopefully move our legislators to do what's right for Hoosiers all across the state.
Mm-hmm. I have a question, I think both for Zach and Ben, just based off of what you've just said here. Are there voices that you think specifically are missing from this fight that would help accelerate it quicker, as far as who the people on the line today and who we can contact more of?
Sure, I'll go ahead and start, and then I'd be interested to hear what Ben has to say. I think that Indiana's solar movement has definitely continued to grow in recent years. It's been great since, Solarize Indiana obviously launched statewide in 2017. Solar United Neighbors launched our Indiana state program in 2019. There have been, folks like Laura with Indiana Distributed Energy Alliance and the folks at Citizens Action Coalition, our partners at Hoosier Environmental Council and Hoosier Interfaith Power and Light that have been, pushing to build Indiana's solar movement for a long time and doing great work. But I think we can absolutely continue to kind of build a bigger tent and bring in more partners to our movement. I think that some of the restrictions on Indiana's solar market have made it harder to reach out to low-income communities and other organizations that work on racial justice issues and housing issues and labor issues the way that other states have been able to build those coalitions, because it's a little bit of a harder case to make here in Indiana than it is in other states. But I think that doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing. So I know that's something that I focus a lot on, trying to broaden and diversify our partnerships. And I think it's something that as a solar movement, we can absolutely always strive to continue to work on, because we need to expand our movement if we want to win. We need to build our power, in the streets, in the state house, because if we could do what we wanted to do with the people we already have in the movement, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Right.
We would have already won. So I think that's, the biggest case we need to make to continue to reach out to new parts of our movement and make sure that we're being as inclusive and equitable as possible.
Couldn't have said it any better, Zach. I completely agree with your points. I would just echo that. Yeah, if you're on this call, we need you. We need you to be part of the solar movement. And we appreciate you attending this today. But we're asking that this webinar not just stay a webinar, but go out into concrete action. And that's why I think Zach provided these great resources of how you can get more involved, because we do need everybody, and we do need to build an inclusive and broader group of folks that are advocating for good solar policy here.
And I do just want to, especially for the recording, who you might not be able to see the chat, Laura has shared a great response, which I just want to read for the recording. She says, we need to increase our solar advocacy efforts to include farmers, conservatives, local Republican office holders like mayors and county commissioners, labor groups such as IBEW and the League of Women Voters, etc. So I completely agree, Laura. And hopefully all of us here on the call tonight are willing to work together to make sure that happens.
Awesome. Thank you both. I think that wraps up all of the questions that were asked, at least in the chat so far. We have a couple minutes left if anyone is still itching about any other curiosities. Otherwise, I'd pass it back to Zach and Ben and thank them for being wonderful minds that we're able to pick kind of in this solar nebulous world that we're delving into.
Well, thank you, Jackie. And we will definitely stay on the line a little bit longer if folks do want to add any more questions to the chat. But in the meantime, I did just want to point to one concrete thing that we hope everybody on the line will do this evening. You can go to solarunitedneighbors.org/IN-solar-future, or just hang out on the line until we end the webinar, and you'll go to that webpage. And that's where you can find an easy one-click action that you can customize to contact your legislator and let them know why you support DG Solar and want to see solar a part of our energy future. You'll also find some additional resources on that webpage. You can see a recording of a great webinar that Solar United Neighbors and Indiana Distributed Energy Alliance conducted last month with two retiring legislators here in Indiana talking about Vectren's case to end net metering and the 21st Century Energy Policy Development Task Force, along with a recording of a webinar Solar United Neighbors conducted in September, talking about the utility cost shift myth that they like to use to push back against net metering. So I encourage you to check out that page and to send a email to your legislators. And when you do that, you will also get access to some resources to help you submit letters to the editor. supporting supporting solar in your community and helping to raise awareness about these issues, which is a really important part of the battle right now, just making sure more folks know about these issues and are aware that there are policy solutions that we can implement right here at home. And then finally, the most important thing you can do is tell your friends. As we've discussed recently, we need to build Indiana's solar movement, and that will start with you talking to your friends, your family, your coworkers about ways that they can take action, and hopefully invite them to future events that Solar United Neighbors or others will be hosting to try to build Indiana's solar movement. And so with that, I think that will probably wrap up our event this evening. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to Ben and Jackie for participating, and for everybody who was on the line submitting great questions and really being engaged in the chat. Really appreciate it. Again, my name is Zach Schalk. I'm the Indiana Program Director for Solar United Neighbors. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at inteam@solarunitedneighbors.org. And I hope you've enjoyed the evening and that you'll check out some of the additional Solar Congress events that we have coming up tomorrow. And so once again, thank you everyone. I hope you have a great evening. We'll talk to you soon.